Okay. Tonight, I'm going to do a bit more like almost foundation work. Right? And I was actually arguing with myself over whether or not to do this or just get straight into interesting things like international finance and usury and all that sort of stuff, just price and whatnot. And I thought that if I jumped straight in and did all that stuff, there's a kind of a dimension that you miss out on. Because one of the things which is really difficult when people approach this, especially when they're sort of coming into it, the church talks about Catholic social thought, whereas the world talks about economics. Right? And there are a lot of assumptions in the discipline of economics that need to be explored and really critiqued, if you like, before you can understand what economics is supposed to do. And the really important thing about that is that economics makes a lot of assumptions about what people are. It doesn't talk about it, but they're there. And they actually end up being really, really important. And so that first question, what are people, sounds really stupid, sounds so obvious, but it's really, really important. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was talking to somebody about various problems. It was kind of related to this economic stuff. And what quickly became apparent to me was that this person had a view of what it was to be human that I thought was really sad. Because it really, if you took it to its logical conclusion, it would see humans as nothing more than animals, and in fact, pretty horrible animals to be around even at that. Right? We've got the two dogs in the backyard. They're animals. And so a lot of things that they do just like animals do. But they're still able to get along with each other to a certain extent. They don't eat each other. Perhaps some bugs kind of do that sort of thing, but by and large, even bugs know that if they're going to eat something, they don't eat another bug of their own type. Right? So there's a kind of honour amongst bugs. And yet, I think, in a way, we've been eased into a belief that humans are, in fact, less human than bugs. Because while we don't necessarily eat each other, we look down on cannibalism, we do eat each other when it comes to taking advantage of each other in the economic realm. Right? This kind of unnecessary violence to other people. And again, if you look at dogs and cats and animals and things, while you might have the odd skirmish between, a couple of lions when they're, got their eye on some lioness, they don't behave like that just as a matter of course. And so it's almost as though, as I guess a Christian, I would say that animals are able to give glory to God in the way that they treat each other in a kind of loving way, to use, anthropomorphic kind of, imagery, better than sometimes humans do. Because if we believe that other humans are just out there and they're going to rip us off, or we've got to rip them off first, we've got this idea of what it is to be human, which I think, when you really look at it, is really, really horrible. Yeah? Yet, in economics, that's the starting point. Have we talked about Homo economicus before? I don't know if I've used that term before. Okay. Homo economicus is it's a classical idea from classical economics. Classical means Enlightenment, by the way. Economics apparently didn't exist before Adam Smith or people like that. And so for those of you who are interested in the history of, the Enlightenment, you'll see that it goes right back to the root. There's nothing written about economics before, the physiocrats, the Enlightenment Frenchmen. Because they have a particular kind of view, a particular anthropology. And what I want to do is go back behind that and look at this question of what it is to be human. Okay, so this is going to be a bit of a digression. So I apologise for digression, but I think hopefully it will make sense further on. Certainly, I don't think anything in Catholic social thought makes sense unless you get your anthropology right. Because I keep coming up with conversations where I politely take people through the idea of just price and and all these other things, and they say, "Oh yeah, but people aren't like that. People are greedy. They want to rip each other off." Right? That's the end of the conversation. I can't. There's no point in trying to have an intellectual conversation beyond that. Because what? There's two very, very fundamentally different views of what it is to be human. So that's why I'm doing this topic tonight. We're going to begin by considering what it is to be human, what the human person is. Now, we're building an idea of Catholic social thought, and so we're going to start off accepting the existence of God and the relationship between humanity and God, and that is that we are made to know, love and serve God in this life and to be with him forever in the next. That's what we are. That's the stuff we're made of. Now, that's easy if you are a Christian. I think that idea is accessible through natural reason. And another time we might talk about proofs for the existence of God, and I allude to that from time to time. But that idea of there being a creator and us being created, made in some way in relationship to him, is something I've seen in a lot of indigenous animist religions and so on. Basically, it's the grounding for all the property rights that I've come across with indigenous people. And so this idea that this relationship with God is something very universal. Humans seem to understand it, which I think is something that Cardinal Newman sort of spotted as a universal characteristic of humans. However, we're going to jump over a couple of steps there and just simply accept that that's what we're going to start with as our understanding. We're also damaged by original sin. Now, this is one of the things that's very difficult for people to understand when they step away from the practice of their faith. And it's, I think, one of the most popular things to insert if you want to build a nice little heresy. Because the neat thing about a heresy is that one way or another you dodge around original sin, and usually in different ways, but you might be sort of talking about being an Arian or something like that, but one way or another it's a way of sort of dodging around our propensities when somehow you turn sin from a bad thing into a good thing. It's an acceptable thing. However, as I think Chesterton was very keen to point out, the most obvious empirical fact pertaining to religion that you're likely to find is the reality of sin. One way or another, you don't have to go sort of far down the street before you find somebody who is doing something that you consider to be wrong, bad, whatever. It's simply there, And again, comparing us to dogs and cats and even bugs and stuff, humans have the capacity to be really, really good people, but for some reason we all have this propensity to sin. So we've got this Janus kind of nature, this sort of two-faced kind of nature. We have other characteristics. We have an intellect and will, and so we're able to rise above our animal instincts. We are ordered towards love because we're ordered towards God. God is always animated by that selfless willing the good of the other, which I would call love, and that's pretty much, I think, part of what we are ordered towards as well. Aristotle described humans as social animals. In one way or another, we can't exist by ourselves. Excuse me. That social character is something which also is rather curious. And if you go into Enlightenment thought, you find that's really bizarre. All of the social contract theories and stuff are all worked on trying to work out how the social kind of stuff works. Because ultimately, Enlightenment man is based on the idea of the individual. And somehow the individual is able to be the atom of society that chooses to form up into a group and then sort of make society because we choose to be a part of it. The reality seems to be kind of the opposite, though. It seems to be fairly evident from observations of human growth, that if we don't grow up within a society, we grow up very damaged. Yeah? And there have been a few cases of people that have been have grown up deprived of human company in different ways. Only a relatively small number of them. People whose family were killed for whatever reason, often in primitive parts of the world, and what have you. And babies of one way or another survived, or maybe they were toddlers or what have you. And when they have been discovered, and sociologists make a big thing of this, there's sort of a few curious things about them. They tend not to walk, they never learn to talk, they can't eat very well, and usually they die very, very young, even if they're very well looked after. In fact, I don't think I know of any of the cases when I was studying this stuff years ago of people coming from that kind of a background who were able to really survive puberty. And during all of that time, they couldn't be taught to talk or to walk or to do many of the things that we would associate as distinctly human. Yeah. So we need other people around us in order to be ourselves. And one way or another, we're connected with our families right from the very beginning. I would say that's part of the way that we're made in the image of God. Right? Because a while back we were talking about the way that God the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost came to be, and that's very, very important for understanding this, because if we really do believe that we're made in the image of God, then it won't be a surprise that we're made social, because the Trinity is social. And that's, I think, very, very important when we sort of move on further to talk about these apparently very dry and economic things kind of later on. There's something wrong when we're not ordered towards love. The last point there is that all humans have equal human dignity, and that's something which is being challenged just about every time we turn around, whether we're talking about abortion or all sorts of things. This idea of distinguishing between the good people and the worthwhile people. We've been talking about Peter Singer recently and that sort of thing. Now, the idea of equal human dignity, okay, we could sort of go in and go through proofs for that, or why it has to be that case. And there are a number of ways of doing it, like a number of ways of proving the existence of God. But you can look at the way that there are things which are unique to humans, and even if you are a real kind of greenie and you believe that dolphins are kind of more intelligent than people and all the rest of it, there are a lot of things that even dolphins don't do that humans do. You know, the level of our conceptual thought, our ability to freely will, it's really very much of an order beyond at least what we can perceive. And to a certain extent, we would be able to communicate with a dolphin, right, far better than dolphins appear to be able to communicate with us. And so if they are mysteriously sitting there, sort of doing, integration in n-dimensional space or something, and they just can't be bothered talking to us, it just seems to be kind of odd that over all of this time they've never actually sort of got through that. One way or another, humans have these intellectual capacities, and those capacities then turn into, especially the capacity for language and the capacity for free will, that really sets us apart. And the fact that each one of us is different, but we all have that non-material capacity. So we can sort of say, okay, we operate with brains and all that. Right? But the fact that this notion of will and the capacity for language is something that goes past our material nature. Right? And so it means that each one of us, when we encounter another thing which is able to do this very, very unique and unusual and non-material thing, then it's very hard to make an argument to say that thing is not equal to me. And from that you end up with human dignity. The idea that if even someone is in a wheelchair, or they have trouble communicating with the outside world, or all of these other kind of handicaps that people might have, doesn't detract from that fundamental nature that they have. Their DNA gives them that capacity to have these unique non-material characteristics which we're all aware of. So we have equal human dignity. We're also made with an appetite for God. Now, as Christians, we are comfortable with that. That's the only reason we probably go to church in a way, because to some bizarre way it feels good. It satisfies an appetite, a hunger that we have. And even if people say, oh, it's boring and all that sort of stuff, there is this, again, non-material appetite. So we have an appetite for something which is bigger than us, more permanent than us, from which we get ultimately our very first or our most primary understanding of society, in a sense. Okay, you get society from your mum and dad and your kids and your brothers and sisters and all that sort of thing. But once you penetrate into an understanding of your relationship with God, your first relationship is in terms of God. So in terms of humans as a social animal, our first relationship is with this infinite, good, benevolent being. And to a certain extent, that relationship becomes more important than all of your earthly relationships. And to a certain extent, all of your earthly relationships are ordered towards that relationship with the big one, the infinite one. Now, understanding what God is important here, because especially for this next little sub-point here, that we can come to the deduction that God is infinite. I think we did that a few weeks ago. And that means our appetite for God is an appetite for an infinite thing. Now, where does that give, what does it say about our appetite? If we have an appetite for an infinite thing, what kind of appetite is it? It's an infinite appetite. And that's one of the reasons why, and I find this in Plato, it's kind of delightful. I can't remember which dialogue, but I think he sort of comes back to it. I know it's in, he sort of uses it a little bit in the Republic, but there are a number of other dialogues where Plato is fascinated, I think, with this way the humans have this capacity or this appetite for perfection. Now, to a certain extent, perfection is an appetite for the infinite. When you play the piano, one of the things I find kind of curious is that a lot of musicians only like to play the stuff that they can't play. If I get Bridget or somebody to come along and play something that they were learning for their exams a year ago, you can't be interested in that. They'll always be really keen on showing you the stuff that they've only learned last week. In fact, they've only half learned it because it's really hard. They can't quite do it, but they want to do it, and it's really, really interesting, right? Because they're aiming at the perfection of music. They want to appropriate perfect musicianship. You want to paint as an artist, always better. When the boys and Teresa go out, they want to be able to come home and get closer to perfection in their artwork. And I think you'll find that in any craft. And, to a certain extent, with the physical things, with plumbing, electrical work, you want, if you're a good one, you want to be perfect. You're always thinking, well, there's a little bit better that I can do. There's always a possibility of improving. Yeah, I used to love motorbikes. I've kind of lost my taste for them, so I find it hard to sort of talk about motorbikes in the same way that I could 20 years ago. But if you get keen on motorbikes are a real thrill until you get old like me, and then you're really afraid they're going to kill you. But when you're young and you don't believe you're going to die, all you can think of is going around that corner a little bit faster, or getting a motorbike that's got better tyres or slightly better suspension, right? So you can go a bit faster. And you're always approaching the infinite. Now, that's a delightful thing, and it's built into so much of what we do and what we draw pleasure from. Why is it that we like looking at the ocean or a sunset? There's something about it that gets us into the infinite. So we've got this capacity, this taste for the infinite. And it's one of the really important reasons why being busy is the devil's work. They say idle hands are the devil's playground, I think, an expression, something like that. Well, to a certain extent, that's right, yeah. But there's also a certain extent where it's actually a bit of a troublesome idea. Because it's very important for people to be truly people, to have leisure, to have time where they do just sit down and look at the sunsets, or paint the picture, or play the piano, or whatever it is that they do, where one way or another they can connect with the infinite. And you need that in your lives. Now, in some cases, it might be, getting the most perfect muscles or something, I don't know. But there are all these places where you're always wanting to go that little bit further, right, and sort of get in contact with it. Why am I drawing this out? Because it's something about our relationship with God. And if we do it properly, all of those things can be a form of prayer, a form of closing that gap between us and the Almighty. And we have that idea. And what do we want to eventually do? Eventually, we want to, as ourselves, as persons, be swept up and be totally absorbed by the contemplation, the lovely experience of the beatific vision. To be able to have that perfection, that infinite, God all around us. And we call that heaven. And so on earth, we get little tastes of that. And it's very healthy for us to give ourselves the opportunity to go and be open to those things. So leisure is very, very important. I often say even the Pope takes a holiday. Okay, if we have a capacity for the infinite, in fact an appetite for the infinite, and it's a healthy part of our nature, that is also something which is a little bit different between us and the dogs and cats. Well, I'm beginning to wonder. Most creatures, if you feed them enough, they stop eating. Dogs don't, right? But whatever it is, most of the time, most material appetites that we have limits. How many chocolates do you want to eat? Well, a lot of people think, oh, I can never stop eating chocolate. Well, in fact, if you put a big enough bowl of chocolates in front of a person, after a while they will stop, right? The pimples will come out, and they'll be fat, and they'll be really uncomfortable, and teeth will fall out, all that sort of carry on. It might take a long time, but one way or another, with every human material appetite, we get to a limit. Yeah. And this is, I think, important, and it's kind of healthy. People that don't find limits in their material appetites, we quite comfortably think of as disordered. You'd send them along for counselling or something. There was, it's before you guys' time, president, I think, of the Philippines, who, I can't remember the number now, but this lady owned hundreds and hundreds, in fact, I think it was over 1,000 pairs of shoes. Now, some people might be able to understand that, I don't know, but for blokes that's pretty hard to get your head around. One way or another, when you look back, you think, whoa, nice lady, it's a great leader and all the rest of it, but something wacky about her relationship with shoes. Why is it that she didn't stop with maybe 200 or 300? And something that we've all got to consider in our lives. But most of the time, you sort of think of moving on something else after you get a certain amount. What am I getting around to there? I think our ultimate appetite is for God, and it's an appetite for the infinite. What that means is that all the other things that can distract us, all the other appetites, and all of them, or most of them, have a good dimension. Ice cream and chocolate and so on. There's a good to ice cream and chocolate. There's a good to every natural appetite if it's taken at the right time, in the right amount, and for the right reason. However, all of those things are limited. And so to a certain extent, after we satiate ourselves with all of these things, we think, oh, what else is there? Oddly enough, that's often the doorway by which people suddenly think, yeah, been there, done that, what do I do now? A bit like St. Ignatius. Remember St. Ignatius? There in his hospital bed or whatever, recuperating, wounded leg, couldn't move, got really bored, read everything in town. Right, what do I do now? Started reading the Lives of the Saints, and we get the Jesuits. In a sense, his boredom with material appetite was the doorway to his relationship with God. And I've heard that a number of times from people that have come into their faith. People like rock singers and stuff who are just about to blow themselves away with drugs or what have you. They've had every pleasure that you can imagine, probably 5 times as intense as the human body was really meant to take it. And then suddenly they discover, oh, I'm sort of so full up with all the stuff, but I'm extraordinarily empty. What do I do now? And if they're really shrewd and if they're open to it, all of a sudden, the hound from heaven will come and get them. And they'll discover God. And that's always lovely stories when you hear those conversion stories. So the finite appetites that we have in the world lead us to the infinite appetite, or the infinite object of our appetite, which is God. Now, what that would suggest is that at the end point of any self-indulgence, we have that doorway that will take us to God. But there's a kind of an exception. And that is that there's one thing, and unfortunately I've got it up on the display there, that is something which we can desire without limit. And okay, the answer is there, it's money. The other thing about money is that it's the one thing, one material thing that we desire without limit because it actually satisfies no desires. If we eat ice cream, it satisfies our hunger for chocolate and all that sort of stuff, right? And eventually we get sick of it. Yeah? But with money, we desire it because it sort of means something to us, a non-material desire in a way. But the more we get of it, well, yeah, okay, I've earned $1,000 or earned a couple of $1,000 or whatever it is. But wouldn't it be nice to have twice as much or 10 times as much? I might have $1 million and I think, oh yeah, that's okay, I can buy a house now. But I'd really like $2 million because I like a better house. Or I might need $10 million so I can have an investment property. You know, and even if you have $10 million, you'll probably want 100. And you don't find a lot of people with $100 million who don't really want $200 million or to sort of crack the first billion. And you know, the Rich 200 in the Business Review Weekly is all about telling us about the Rich 100 or whatever in Australia. And those guys are sort of competing with each other because they've only got a couple of billion, and they're hungry for more. Money is like that. It satisfies no material need, and therefore we desire it without limit. That makes it, I think, the closest thing to God on earth. And a lot of people think, oh, you go to hell because, you know, you end up getting caught up in sex and drugs and who knows what. But all those things are material appetites, and they have material limits, even though they'll take you to hell if you do it the wrong way. However, money is curious because it has this capacity to develop that infinite hunger, which is it's the only one in creation which can parallel our hunger for God. As a result of that, and I guess later on I'll be kind of coming back to this idea, I think the love of money is really the ultimate sort of weakness that we have. I suspect that avarice is the sin at the end of history. It's the expression that I use from time to time. Okay. Overall, we understand that we need control of our lower appetites. And that sort of comes back to these ideas of poverty, chastity, and obedience, which are these approaches, these very fundamental approaches that we have that sort of keep our lives in order. So that's kind of the human person. When I was talking about the appetite for God versus the appetite for money, one of the things which stands out when you kind of order your life around the appetite for money is that getting money is something which is done at somebody else's expense, often. There are two ways, and we're going to be sort of exploring this when we look at the way that our business world, our working life works. I guess we probably need to explain a little bit here. I could maybe work as a farmer to grow something. Okay, so I do a fair bit of work, okay, grow some food, maybe really nice food. I might be running a vineyard, right? So that takes a little bit more skill than simply growing grapes. Okay, because I've got to grow the grapes, and then I'm going to turn it into wine. Might be nice wine, might be vinegar. Okay, one way or another, if I do a really good job and I produce some really nice wine, then one way or another, you know, that's going to be sort of a fairly comfortable way to earn a living, right? Because that people will really want that, and I'll be giving a lot of pleasure to people. To a certain extent, my rewards there are related to the amount of work that I put in, the skill I put into it, and also the level of the enjoyment, the delight that I sort of give to other people. And you can apply that to almost any, you know, trade, craft, whatever. If I'm earning my income from the gift that I'm giving, the improvement that I'm giving, the good that I'm giving to the people around me, in a sense, I'm helping the community around me, and in so doing, I derive my livelihood. So again, if we sort of go back to day-to-day kind of jobs like driving taxis, serving in a shop, you know, building houses, all that sort of stuff, if I build a house or sort of do a plumbing job or something in a nicer way than what the competition is doing, then in a sense, my income comes because I've given this extra level of goodness to the community. Okay? That approach in economics, which is where we're going to be taking this, really sees society as a community, as a place where you're kind of relating to the other in the kind of gift relationship that we're talking about, you know, with Pope Benedict. The alternative is where I take an opportunity where I know that I can go down the street somewhere and maybe buy something that people want. House bricks, right? Doesn't really matter what it is. And I find that there's some place where I can get house bricks really, really cheaply, which really means that the house brick manufacturer doesn't know the value of the things that he's doing, and he's willing to sort of sell them to me for just about nothing. And then I go along to somebody who's really wanting to build a house, you know, the Third Little Pig or whoever it is, right? And they really, really want the house bricks. They don't know how much the house brick manufacturer sold them for, and so I get them for just about nothing down one end of town, and I sell them for an awful lot of money down the other end of town. And sure enough, I've done a bit of transport and that kind of carry on. But how am I actually making my money in that situation? I'm making it by playing on the ignorance of the people around me. The fellow who's making the house bricks ends up not earning from them what the quality of his work deserves, so he's kind of ripped off a bit. And the person who's buying them is paying more for them than is really in them, in a sense. You can take this sort of too extremely if you like. You know, if you take it too far, you end up with no wholesalers and no people transporting and merchants and all that sort of carrying on. So you've got to be a little bit sort of careful with the dimensions here. But if your focus is primarily on getting the house bricks for as cheap as possible and selling them for as much as possible, then the way you're earning your income isn't by helping people, it's by exploiting them, using them as something that you're living off. Does that sort of make sense? Now this is where it becomes a little bit subtle, because, you know, if you take a very black and white simplistic kind of view here, there would be no wholesalers, no importers, no shopkeepers, none of a whole lot of things which are really, really important and necessary in our community. But what you have to do is understand just what the limits are with all those things. Right? And almost in every case, you can go from being the community kind of person, helping out the community, or the exploiter or what have you, and doing pretty much the same job. Right? So you can do that as a plumber, you can do that as a shopkeeper, you can do that, you know, in my job. All of those have those two dimensions. So it's not clear cut, and one way or another, as we go along, we have to think through where one fades into the other. This can be really frustrating, because especially when we're sort of younger, we like the idea of, you know, tell the truth, it's fine. That's when you say what is actually going on. Telling a lie, that's bad. You go to confessional, you might go to hell if you sort of stay with it. You know? And it's like clear cut, crisp. You know? If I know that there's, I don't know, dogs and cats or lions and tigers in the backyard, and I tell you there aren't, and you go out and get eaten by the lions and tigers, I've told you a lie and bad things happen and all that sort of carry on, and it's kind of really clear and crisp. When we're getting into these things, the issues are not nearly as clear cut. You know? And so we've got to kind of get to some distinctions as to how to identify them. But overall, there's two notions of society, two ways of making money, and they kind of line up. Okay, is society as community, as like a family, or is society as an association where you have the self-interested individuals, which is the idea you get, this enlightenment idea of what the human person is, as this little atom, which is somehow independent, rational, supposedly, and really out to rip everybody else off. And one way or another, that really started, I think, back with Machiavelli, at least in terms of, you know, the history of Western thought. So you've got, you know, now we've got at least 500 years of that kind of tradition. But that Machiavellian approach, the Enlightenment approach, always leads to ultimately, you know, the go of civilization. That's what we saw in our first note. Some other things about humans, and some other things which are ignored in economics. Economics talks about self-interested, rational individuals as the economic actor. It doesn't bother to talk about those creatures as being mortal. You know, they die. They need to be fed. They need to be clothed, and all that sort of carry on. And it's not that you're getting fed and clothed because that's what you like and you simply want more of it. Literally, there is this life and death aspect to it. And so we have to kind of keep in mind that man is mortal, and those material needs that we have are a necessary, natural part of our life. And if we have a right to life, which I would say is fairly self-evident, we can kind of talk about that tonight. But if we have a right to life, then we have a right to those things that we need for life, which is the food, clothing, and shelter. The downside there is that most of the time, to get our food, clothing, and shelter, it's not a matter of simply picking it up off the ground or plucking it off a tree or what have you. There's a fair bit of labour that kind of goes into actually getting it. And so the economic problem is really how do you go from the acquisition of food, clothing, and shelter, like in terms of getting the stuff, and then making it available to the person who actually sort of needs it for their life. And so we need to get around this, or at least factor in the fact that man is mortal. Next point is curious because self-interested, the rational self-interested individual, the economic man, doesn't have families. And that's kind of curious. Just a couple of factors about that I want us to think about. We talked about substances before. Don't know if we have. Okay. In philosophy, a substance is something that can exist by itself. That's fairly familiar. And so water is a substance that exists by itself, whereas a lot of things that we don't consider substance because they just, they're not, they don't have this sort of stability and completeness. When we think of what it is to be human, and our topic tonight is really looking at this question, a curious thing comes up. Because people die, the individual, in a sense, is not a substance because it can't exist by itself. When you think about what the human substance is, I think the human substance is probably, it's the family. The reason for that is that as you go through time, the individual humans come and go, a bit like the chicken and the egg. Right? But what is the thing which kind of perdures, which really is the part which enables that social reproduction? It's the family. That means that we've got a mortal family as the basic unit of all our economics. Often now, I think one of the things which we're kind of losing sight of in our culture especially is that relatively simple kind of fact. And the place where we see it in terms of practical problems is just something as simple as the price of housing. Houses are now so expensive that they're really outside the capacity of the family to own. Right? Because for a family to operate, families are about children and all that sort of thing. Now, if we get to the stage where the family can't survive within a society, you really can't have a society. When you need 2.5 incomes in order to be able to, provide shelter, it's saying something very, very unhealthy because that society is not going to be able to survive. So if our idea is that the economy or our economic idea is about the right to life, food, clothing, and shelter, if we then put ourselves in a situation where we basically price it out of existence, where individuals can survive, you guys might all be able to live as individuals and maybe sort of rent a place somewhere and work until you drop and all that sort of carry on. But the idea of doing whatever it takes to have a family, right, if that can't happen, then we've kind of lost the plot big time. So one way or another, economics has to be focused on the family primarily, not on the individual. And so much of what we find in terms of current economic policy is all focused on the individual. We pay tax as individuals, we do lots and lots of things as individuals. Oddly enough, the only thing we don't do kind of really as individuals is the way that when we borrow money to buy houses, maybe this is kind of my special interest, but the bank will actually sort of say, hey, okay, we've got Mr. and Mrs. Jones here. We'll sort of take her income, his income, maybe Junior's income or what have you, and we'll lend you as much as we can on those 3 incomes' ability to pay it, or 2 incomes, or whatever it is, to be a little bit more serious. One of the few places where we kind of recognise a family. But in a sense, it's recognise a family in order to exploit it, through debt and so on, as far as possible, and make it kind of impossible. I'll just do one little, well, I won't say it's an aside, but there was a chap, an economist by the name of Simon, who some years ago, I think this was back in about the 1970s, did an economic analysis of the family. And one of the things which he concluded, and he used sort of regular economic analysis and all the rest of it, and one of the things which is really big in economics is the idea of specialisation of labour. And it's pretty obvious that if you have people who are specialised, if you get, somebody who's specialised, I don't know, growing food, somebody else is specialised making houses, somebody else is specialised making clothes, each one of those doing their specialisation and then sort of exchanging it is a lot more efficient than, me being an amateur electrician, an amateur plumber, an amateur car mechanic, an amateur this and amateur that, right? So this idea of specialisation of labour is really, really important. Simon came along and he applied that to the family, and his conclusion was the most efficient way for society to operate is actually to do this division of labour, and from that, the family will then be far wealthier in this pure economic terms. Whereas if you get everybody trying to sort of do everything, and this is, you end up with a lot of inefficiencies. That idea used to be something that was quite, normal and just accepted as part of our culture. I remember when I was a kid, we were told about how dreadful it was in Russia and how inhuman it was because women had to go to work. And one of the things that's kind of curious now is that we've got rid of communism, that's fantastic, but the idea of ladies going to work, it's kind of a right, a necessity, and all this sort of stuff. Whereas, I'm an old bloke, but in living memory, it was considered to be something that was actually inhuman and somehow uncivilised. And yet we've kind of done this complete turnaround. That sort of comes out especially with the matter of contraception. Now, up here I'm kind of describing or putting contraception up as a violation of the Trinitarian nature of the family, right? Because by putting a block between mum and dad and the future, right, you're really, in a sense, violating that model, the way that we image the primitive society or the first society, and it gets to be a pretty total separation. And what it does ultimately, and again we don't have time to go into this in so much detail, but I think most of you can kind of see where I'm kind of going with this, or at least where the arguments come from, that it changes it transforms the relationship from community into association. Instead of being here as a gift of love for each other, the two people are there for what they can get out of it. And then again you see we're going from modelling our relationships on God and generative receptive love and all of that sort of interaction of love that you get in the Trinity to being modelled on business. Because business is about buying the house bricks cheap, selling them dear, right? Keeping ignorance going and getting the maximum deal for me. There's this kind of this resonance that kind of goes through. Now, to a certain extent, when we take that idea and we put it into our economics, we end up with some pretty stunning results. Before I get to that, I just want to look at the way that this different relationship is something that is fairly well recognised. Okay? Christians have known it from the word go, right? That it's a bad thing. But when you get, I won't say pagans, but people that by and large spend most of their time being anti-Christian, recognising the mechanics of what this does, I think it says that it's not just some Catholic peculiarity, it is actually there physically, in the fabric of society. Now, realistically, this exploitation of the other is exactly Karl Marx's social thought. and if you do a little bit of sociology, you come across fairly early conflict theory. Okay, and the conflict theory of society goes back to Marx and all the rest of it. Now, Marx is a Fruit Loop, and nice conservative Christian people shouldn't think about Marx and all that sort of carry on. But one way or another, he's putting his finger on something which is very much happening in our world. Right? Society is getting to be more of this world where we seeing each other as something to exploit for our own benefit. And when we're sort of talking in terms of contraception, that's largely what there is. We want all of the nice benefits from that, but we don't want any of the obligations. Thank you very much. We'll leave that for somebody else to look after. When you go down that any distance, I would say that you come up with a view of society which is very close to the relationship of the demons in hell. And I'll leave that for another time to talk about. And I think I have, in one of our other talks, talked about the way that this Hegelian thought, coming from Hegel, who was a forerunner to Marx, is really this idea of all relationships as conflict, as exploitation, destruction of the other. Isn't that exactly what how the devil relates to the other devils and to us? It's relationships of hatred, ultimately. And it all comes through this apparently very nice, friendly kind of thing, just helping people not to have families that are too big, this contraception thing. And so even, Marx was I think he was a Satanist. There seems to be an awful lot of evidence in that direction, but even there, actually saying this is the way that it is, very, very unhealthy. Now, when you get this thing, which is very quiet and private and all that sort of carry on, and it gets into the economy, how does it get into the economy? First of all, it's not because we're sort of talking about the profits that are being made from the pill, or how much Planned Parenthood makes from, trafficking sort of baby body parts and stuff. The way this gets into the economy is simply in terms of the way that it frees a lot more people to go to work. To do that, I just want to look a little bit at the history of contraception. We're going to be sort of coming back to this later on, but I'll just kind of finish on this because it shows us, I think, some of the peculiarities of the part of history that we're living in at present. This graph shows the total fertility rate in Australia over the last century or so. In fact, I think it starts back around the end or the last quarter of the 1800s. Now, I think this is a very useful little graph because these trends are things which can't continue to go down. Yeah? Let's look at some of the numbers. Back around the last quarter of the 19th century, fertility rates in Australia, as best as I can make out from the statistics that are available, was somewhere in the high fives in terms of the number of babies the average woman in Australia had. Okay, it was somewhere, I think it was kind of getting perilously close to 6 from what I can make out. Certainly there are statistics there, but it was the statistics expressed in a different way, and but that appears to be the number. However, in that last 20 years of the 1800s, most of the current forms of contraception, with the exception of the pill, were pretty much perfected to the point where they were getting to be pretty effective. And what we had was an alarming drop in the fertility rate, which hadn't been seen previous to that. And I don't have this back through the 19th century, so you can't sort of say or show the way that's 6. But you can get a bit of a hint by looking at the fertility rates around the world. Okay, and if you get to places like Africa and stuff like that, what you'll find is that the fertility rates kind of get up around 6, and they tend not to get very much higher. I'm not aware of any country in the world that has a fertility rate, well, certainly higher than 9, and I think most of them are around 6. In fact, I can't even remember seeing 8 or 9 if you get them from the UN and stuff, these kind of graphs. So I would say that if you have a society which is not practicing contraception, 6 is about the natural kind of level. Okay, and that was about where New South Wales was before that. However, around that time, around 1870, 1880, all of these kind of new technologies came in, and as a result of that, our fertility rate fell to the point where when you get to about 1900, you notice there's a little flattening off around here. It's actually flattened off. We look at the big trend, but if you look at it a little bit closer, you see there's actually a little micro kind of thing happening here. It's actually sort of flattened off to the point where it's kind of plateauing around 1900. Around 1900, we had a Royal Commission in New South Wales, and it was to investigate the impacts, and they were concerned because they saw them as harmful impacts, of the rapid fall in the fertility rate on the future of New South Wales. And it was such an important problem, and they saw it as a major problem, that they had a Royal Commission into it. It was such a major problem. And that was when the fertility rate fell, let's say, from about 6 to about 4. And it sort of flattened out there. When you kind of carry forward, the next major change was around 1930. And you see it's kind of trending down there, trending down. But there was quite a little shoulder here around 1930, I think. I hope I'm not being too ambitious in seeing that. The first time I started to look at these numbers closely, I only had statistics back to 1900. And if you do the graph from 1900, it really does look like you've got a slight trend down, but then 1930, you end up with this precipitous drop almost instantly, almost overnight. You have this massive drop. The drop there was down to what we call the replacement level, and that was where we got to the point where families, women, were only having enough babies to just replace the population. So there's going to be no growth in the Australian population in this period from about 1930 for about 10 years or so up to about 1940, 45, something like that. Some of this low level. And then the numbers have climbed a bit. They climbed to a peak at about 1960, and then the pill dropped off, and the thing has kind of become history ever since. This is kind of useful because we talk a lot about the baby boomers. Baby boomers come in here. Baby boomers are people that were born around 1960, right? Now just look at the baby boomers. Was it a real boom? It was a sort of relatively short-lived return to the fertility rate, which was at that point an historic low. And that's significant. That's our part of history. Really, this part, this side of, let's say, the Second World War. What we've seen is, one way or another, we have seen relatively high fertility rates compared to our experience. So rates, I think, went up to about 3.6 something or other. And then it started to fall. You notice how it's flattened out again? And a lot of people are kind of celebrating, oh, this is fantastic. The fertility rate's not falling anymore. What's that going to do for our society? This graph is the workforce participation. In other words, what percentage of the female population was involved in work, taken for different age groups. And the age groups that I've looked at are only a limited number. I'm looking at the age groups between 30 and 45. And I'm looking at those age groups, and this is kind of me as an economist looking at them, because girls 15 to 25 are often unmarried before many of them have starting families and so on. So in a sense, working in those age groups is not really controversial, and contraception doesn't really have anything, doesn't have a great deal to do with it. By the time you get into late 40s, 50s and so on, by and large, families, not having, it's kind of the children are now growing up, and again, whether or not a lady is working at that point, again, is less controversial because there's no real need in the family, and the choice isn't between having children and having work, right? Once you get to those ages, because basically the family's in place. Okay. If you look at that graph, you see we go from about 1960 up to about 1980 roughly, starting to kind of flatten off. By the time you get to certainly by about 1990, you see it, the graph is kind of flattening out fairly substantially. The significance of that is that there's a fairly standard level of female labour force participation in those early years of the century. Then we've kind of gone through this transition period, and now we're up at a point which is also kind of fairly stable. Now, why is that so important? I'd say it's important because during that period we've gone from a non-contraceptive mentality, and even though we're looking at the long-term trends there, falling from 1870 and so on, at the point of the baby boom, there was still a mentality of sort of child-friendliness, if you like, in society. Once you get to our part of society, it's really kind of, we're adopting now an anti-child household mentality, as in general. I'm not saying that everybody does it, just if you look at, what is the determining character of our culture, you'd say, well, there are people who have families and there are people who stay at home mums and that sort of stuff, but they're not typical. The typical ones are the ones that have got double incomes, no kids. Yeah. This change from one cultural form to the other cultural form really happened in this period between about 1960 and about 1990. During that time, if we were to go back to the other graph, what we would see is that the fertility rates have fallen, but during that time also was a time when economically we became very wealthy and comfortable, but oddly enough, a time when we went from being able to live comfortably with a family being able to support itself economically and be a family, to this side of about 1990, we've got this other world that I've been describing, which is where, in general, for most people, it's very difficult for a family economically to be able to support itself, and it has this completely different character. Okay, got one more graph and we'll just finish with this one. This is a graph of the affordability index. Now, there are lots of ways of measuring affordability, but this is really plotting the ratio of the housing cost to the household income, okay, for families. And so at the beginning of the graph, we've got housing costing about, well, you're paying on rent, paying off the mortgage, that sort of stuff. For a lot of people, it's down around less than 20% of the household's income is being paid towards putting a roof over your head, right? By the time you get up to the other end up here, which is 2010, we're up around half of the household income is being used for housing. Now, what's that saying? What that's saying is that during this period, we've kind of transformed ourselves to the point where we're spending a huge amount of our income simply on doing something which, is sort of so basic that we can't really do anything else with it. And by the time we're spending half our income on that, that means that, there's so much less of our household income that's able to be spent on all the other stuff with life. Remember earlier on I was saying the importance of leisure, the importance of family, it's all gone out. A big part of the change is probably not so obvious in here, but when I said between about 1960 and about 1990, something like that, you end up with this change. This spike here would line up with a fairly major recession we had around 1989, 1990, which slowed down the economy fairly substantially. But I'd say that this trend towards the rising household unaffordability was something that sort of came into our psyche as a result of the economic power that the household was given as a result of contraception. Once it's come in, it's very difficult to get it out. And even though it's kind of fallen again, and what sort of fell there largely was a major drop in interest rates. So here interest rates got very, very high very quickly, and then they've fallen, so now we've got relatively low interest rates. But even with the low interest rates, we've still got this mentality of bidding our house prices up. Here they're unaffordable, of course. Interest rates were just ridiculously high. Here they're high for some other reason, because our psychology has kind of changed in terms of the way we meet the housing markets. One way or another, this graph is going the wrong way. It's meaning that our society is becoming less family friendly, and our economics in some way is distorted because it's no longer really working, how can I put this, It's not serving humanity. It's serving individuals, but it's not serving the real humanity. And I guess that's really my point that I've been trying to get us to think about tonight. That the real humanity that we must consider is something which now we're seeing in the data, and especially with the stimulus, I would say, of the contraceptive mentality, we've now kind of lost it. It's about as far as I want to take it. Thank you very much.